I never thought a regular Monday morning at the office would be the start of something that would shake the ground beneath my feet. It started just like any other day, coffee in hand, laptop open, deadlines looming. I was exhausted, both mentally and emotionally. My marriage was falling apart quietly, like a slow leak that no one notices until the damage is done. I didn't talk about it at work. In fact, I didn't talk about it at all. But maybe that silence made the loneliness worse. My boss, David, had always been kind to me. Not in a flirty or overly familiar way, just gentle, respectful, and always noticing the little things. Like the mornings I came in with puffy eyes, or the times I skipped lunch. He'd quietly leave a snack on my desk or send a one-line message asking if I was okay. At first, I dismissed it as simple professionalism. But over time, those small gestures became something I waited for. That particular day, I was barely holding it together. I had just come back from a meeting with my husband's lawyer. We weren't divorced yet, but the words had been said, the damage was real, and the space between us felt impossible to close. I walked into the office feeling like a ghost, invisible, hollow, just going through the motions. I stayed late, hoping the quiet would calm me down. Most of the lights were off, the office nearly empty. That's when David walked in. He didn't say anything at first. Just sat beside me, offering a quiet presence that felt oddly comforting. I don't know why I started crying. Maybe it was the silence, or the way he looked at me like he saw right through all the layers I'd been wearing. I tried to wipe my tears and pretend nothing was wrong, but it was too late. David didn't ask what was going on. He just reached out, not in a way that felt wrong or intrusive, but careful. Almost like he was afraid to cross a line, but still wanted me to know I wasn't alone. When he touched my arm gently, I didn't pull away. And that scared me more than anything else. In that moment, something shifted. It wasn't dramatic or loud. Just a flicker of emotion, of tension, of something we both knew shouldn't be happening. And yet, it was there, real, undeniable, and hanging in the air between us. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words didn't come. Instead, I just looked at him, unsure whether I was about to make a huge mistake, or finally feel something again after being numb for so long. And then, he said something I never expected. Something that made my heart stop and my mind race. But I'll tell you what he said, and what happened next, in the next part of the story. He looked at me and said quietly, "You don't have to pretend with me." Those words hit me harder than I expected. No one had said anything like that to me in a long time. I'd spent months holding everything in, the pain, the confusion, the quiet heartbreak of watching my marriage slip away. I didn't even know what I needed anymore. But in that moment, sitting there in the half-lit office with David, it felt like someone finally saw me. I didn't know what to say. My throat tightened, and all I could do was nod slightly, avoiding his eyes. I was afraid of what he might see if I looked directly at him, the guilt, the doubt, and maybe, something I wasn't ready to admit. David stood up slowly and walked toward the window, his hands in his pockets like he was trying to hold something back too. "You've been carrying this weight alone," he said, not turning around. "I've seen it for months." I wanted to deny it, but how could I? I had been carrying everything, the long nights, the silence at home, the fights that never really ended, just paused. And somehow, he had noticed what even my own husband didn't. That's when I started wondering, why did he care so much? Why did it feel like his words were more than just concern from a boss? It made my heart beat faster, not because I was excited, but because I was scared. Scared of what it would mean if I let someone else in. Especially someone like David. He finally turned back around and walked closer again. "I just don't want you to think you're alone in this world," he said softly. His voice was calm, steady, almost too steady. That was the moment I realized, this wasn't just about me anymore. There was something between us, something unspoken that neither of us had acknowledged until now. I could feel the tension in the air. My hands were trembling, and I didn't know if it was from fear, guilt, or something else entirely. I looked up at him, and for a second, our eyes really met. And there was something in his gaze I hadn't seen before. Something deeper, something that raised questions I wasn't ready to answer. He reached for his coat and said, "You should go home. But if you ever need to talk, I'm here." And just like that, he walked out, leaving me in that empty office, heart pounding, mind spinning, and a storm of questions that I couldn't ignore anymore. I sat there long after David left, staring at the door like it might open again. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't breathe properly. I should have gone home. I should have just picked up my bag, shut off the lights, and left everything behind for the night. But instead, I sat in that silence, trying to make sense of what just happened. His words kept echoing in my mind, "You don't have to pretend with me." It was such a simple thing to say, but it cut through everything I'd been hiding. For days after that night, I kept our interaction locked away in the back of my mind, trying to convince myself it didn't mean anything. I threw myself into work, stayed busy, stayed late. But every time I heard his voice or caught a glimpse of him walking down the hallway, that tension came rushing back. It wasn't romantic, not exactly. It was complicated. Emotional. Dangerous. At home, things were worse than ever. My husband barely spoke to me unless it was about bills or logistics. We slept in the same house, but in different worlds. The distance between us had grown so wide, it felt impossible to reach across. I'd tried to fix things, therapy, long talks, even quiet nights where I just hoped we could feel something again. But nothing worked. I think we both knew the marriage was over. We just didn't have the courage to say it out loud. Meanwhile, David had started acting differently too. Not obviously, but just enough that I noticed. He was more careful with his words in front of others, more distant when people were around. But whenever we were alone, even just briefly, I could feel the shift. There were pauses in our conversations that lasted a little too long. Glances that felt loaded with things neither of us dared to say. And then something unexpected happened. One of my coworkers, Jenna, pulled me aside one afternoon. She said she'd noticed the way David looked at me. At first, I denied it, laughed it off like she was imagining things. But she just gave me this look, the kind that tells you she sees more than you're letting on. That conversation shook me. If Jenna could see it, who else could? Was I walking into something I didn't fully understand? Or had I already crossed a line without realizing it? I told myself to stay focused, to keep things professional. But deep down, I knew it was too late for that. The days that followed were heavy. Every moment at the office felt like I was walking on thin ice, pretending to be okay while something inside me kept shifting. I avoided being alone with David, not because I didn't want to see him, but because I was afraid of what might happen if I did. I kept conversations short, didn't stay late, and tried to focus on the endless emails and reports. But none of it helped. My mind wasn't where it needed to be. And then, the company planned a weekend retreat, just 2 days out of town for team bonding and presentations. I almost didn't sign up, but David personally asked me to come. "You've been working hard. You deserve the break," he said, his tone calm, but his eyes said something else. I told myself it was just work. Just a trip. When we got to the retreat venue, a quiet resort just outside the city, things felt different right away. People were relaxed, laughing more. But I couldn't ignore the energy between us. At dinner, David sat at the other end of the table, but his eyes found mine more than once. I kept reminding myself there were people everywhere. That nothing could happen. That nothing should happen. That night, I went back to my room early, thinking distance was the safest choice. But just as I was about to turn off the light, there was a soft knock at my door. My heart skipped. I froze for a second. I knew who it was before I even opened it. David stood there, not saying anything right away. The hallway was dim, quiet. We both knew what this looked like, what it could become. But he didn't try to come in. He just said, I need to ask you something, and I'll go. I promise. I nodded slowly, unsure of everything. He looked directly at me, his voice low. Is this just in my head? Or is there something between us that neither of us wants to admit? My breath caught in my throat. The air felt thick with everything unspoken. My heart was racing, and every part of me was on edge. I could feel the line we were standing on, one small step, and everything could change. I didn't answer right away. I didn't know how. Because in that moment, I was balancing between what I wanted and what I knew could break me. I stood there, frozen, unsure what to say. David was waiting for an answer, his eyes not demanding, just hoping. And for a second, I almost said it, that yes, something was happening between us, something I didn't know how to explain but felt deeply. But before I could open my mouth, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was late. No one ever called me at this hour anymore. I glanced at the screen. My husband's name lit up in bold. I hesitated. Everything in that moment was tangled, past, present, maybe even the future. I stepped back and picked up the phone, holding up a hand to David. Give me a minute, I said softly. I answered, expecting silence or another half-hearted check-in. But his voice was different this time, anxious, tight, almost afraid. Are you alone? He asked immediately. I frowned, confused. Yeah, why? He paused, then dropped a sentence that made my blood run cold. I know you're not at home. And I know who you're with. I froze. My heart started pounding, not from guilt, but from shock. How did he know? I hadn't told him about the retreat, and we hadn't spoken properly in days. Before I could ask, he added, I saw the email from your office. I logged into your account last week. I felt like the ground had been pulled out from beneath me. All this time, I thought my husband had checked out. Turns out, he was watching, quietly, in the background, keeping track of things I thought he no longer cared about. But there was something off in his tone, it wasn't just jealousy. It was panic. I saw your chats with David. The ones from last month, he said. You think I didn't notice how distant you've been? I thought you were just grieving the marriage, but now I'm not so sure. I swallowed hard, trying to calm my breath. I'd never sent anything inappropriate to David. But there had been a few long messages, late replies, small signs of emotional closeness. And now, those moments were being twisted into something bigger. More dangerous. David was still standing by the door, watching me. I turned my back to him as my husband continued. You don't get it. If anything's going on, if you're doing something stupid, it's not just your life you'll ruin. That's when I realized it wasn't just suspicion, it was a threat. Not loud, not obvious, but buried deep in his words. He knew I was emotionally vulnerable, he knew about David, and now, he had something over me. I ended the call, my hands shaking. David asked gently, everything okay? I lied and said yes. But inside, everything was falling apart. This wasn't just about a possible connection anymore. Now there were consequences. Real ones. And I was trapped between two versions of myself, the woman who stayed silent, and the one about to make a choice that could change everything. I didn't sleep that night. After the call ended, I sat in the dark staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. My husband's words kept echoing, it's not just your life you'll ruin. What did that even mean? Was he just angry, or was he planning something? I thought about David, about the way he looked at me earlier that evening, and then I thought about how quickly everything had spun out of control. What started as comfort had turned into something dangerous. I wasn't sure what was real anymore, my feelings, or the pressure I'd been under for so long. The next morning, the retreat ended. People laughed and took photos, packing their bags like nothing had changed. But inside me, everything had. I avoided David, barely meeting his eyes. I could feel he knew something wasn't right, but he didn't press me. Maybe he understood that pushing would only make things worse. When I returned home, the house felt different. My husband wasn't there, but there was an envelope waiting for me on the kitchen table. Inside was a printed email, one of the conversations between me and David. It wasn't scandalous, but it was emotional. Too emotional. The kind of message that could be twisted into something it wasn't. Along with it was a note, "Don't test me. This doesn't need to get worse." My stomach dropped. It wasn't just about jealousy anymore. This was control. He was using my own vulnerability against me. And suddenly, I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I walked into David's office. My hands were shaking, but I was done being silent. I told him everything, the phone call, the emails, the note. His face didn't change much, but I could see the concern behind his calm expression. He didn't touch me. He didn't say anything inappropriate. He just listened. Then he did something I didn't expect. He reached into his desk and pulled out a document. "I wasn't sure whether to show you this," he said. "But I think you need to see it." It was his resignation letter, dated 2 weeks ago. "I was planning to leave the company," he explained. "Not because of you, but because I felt like I was crossing lines emotionally I shouldn't. I didn't want to hurt you. Or myself." I stared at him, stunned. All this time, I thought I was the one on the edge. But he had already seen it coming. For the first time, I felt something like relief. Not because everything was okay, but because the truth was finally out. There were no more secrets. No more hiding. But just as I thought the storm had passed, my phone buzzed again. It was a message from an unknown number. "I warned you. You should have stayed quiet." And just like that, I realized the story wasn't over. Not yet. I stared at the message, the words sinking in slowly. "I warned you. You should have stayed quiet." It didn't feel like a threat anymore, it felt like fear, like control slipping through fingers that were used to holding tight. My hands trembled, but something inside me had changed. I was done letting fear guide my choices. I showed the message to David, and without hesitation, he said, "You need to protect yourself. This is not just about emotions now, it's about your safety." That was the moment I decided to take back control of my life. I went to the HR department that same day and reported everything: David's emotional involvement, my husband's invasion of privacy, and the threatening messages. To my surprise, the company didn't punish me or David. In fact, they quietly supported the decision he had already made to resign and made sure my personal information was more secure going forward. No scandal, no noise. Just a quiet understanding that sometimes life gets messy, and sometimes, people are just trying to survive it. At home, I packed a bag. I didn't leave a note. I didn't wait for a confrontation. I stayed with a friend for a while and began the divorce process. It wasn't easy. There were days I questioned everything, nights I couldn't sleep, and moments when guilt still whispered in my ear. But I kept going. David left the company and moved to a different city. We stayed in touch for a while, honestly, kindly, but we both knew it wasn't meant to continue. What we had was real, but it came out of broken places in both of us. And maybe that's why it had to end, not in fire, but in understanding. Looking back now, I can see how slowly the cracks had formed, how loneliness, silence, and emotional neglect had worn me down until even the smallest kindness felt like a lifeline. This wasn't just a story of infidelity, it was a story of rediscovery. Of finding strength after losing parts of yourself. I was crying when my boss touched me gently, not because I was falling, but because I was finally waking up. And though the journey wasn't perfect, I came out stronger, clearer, and finally free. Because sometimes, healing starts when the pretending stops. And that truth, that quiet, painful truth, is where real life begins. 41.